Freight Efficiency with NACFE's Mike Roth and Friends.
Here in episode 51, we're joined by Alan Schaeffer. He's executive director of the Diesel Technology Forum, where we talk about why his organization was formed and the purpose it still serves. He also talks about how his childhood influenced his interest in air quality, the apples to oranges comparison of passenger cars and commercial vehicles. We also discuss why diesel will continue to be the dominant fuel for the next several decades, and the things that can be done to make diesel even cleaner than it is today.
Today we have joining me Alan Schaeffer. Alan's the executive director at the Diesel Technology Forum. It's a real pleasure to have you on today, Alan. Thanks for joining us.
Great to be with you, Mike.
Yeah, as I always say every time we get together, this podcast is titled Freight Efficiency with NACFE's Mike Roth and Friends. And I'm learning so much, Alan, as I talk to amazing people, all of which I kind of knew before. But do you remember how sort of NACFE and the forum first got together, or how you and I met? Do you recall?
I was thinking about that, Mike, and I think it must have been during your run at Navistar, one of your former lives. I had a good number of meetings in Melrose Park there when I was at the American Trucking Association. So it was a place and a good number of people there that were not unfamiliar to me. So I want to say there for the first time, but more recently, we've certainly recognized NACFE's great work, and I've had you on as a panelist at some of the SAE government industry meetings over the last 10 years or so.
Let's start with you telling us a little bit about the Diesel Technology Forum. Tell us what you do there and what the organization is and does.
The forum was established, 22 years ago, and heavy-duty truck and engine OEMs got together and convinced some of their colleagues in the supplier community and the oil industry to come together on a new effort that was needed in their minds to educate folks about diesel. We were at that time was coming off a pretty heavy time in the regulatory world for heavy-duty engine manufacturers, and that was sort of the 2000 standards. And there was just a feeling that folks didn't appreciate all that diesel technology did, how efficient it was, and with that new rule now 20 years ago, where it was going in terms of being a way to help improve air quality and continue to deliver all the things that our economy demanded. So that group of folks got together and said, let's set something up and try something out. If it doesn't work, we won't do it anymore. But lo and behold, it did work. The forum is kind of an unusual organization in that we have truck and engine and equipment OEMs, light duty manufacturers, off-road equipment folks, renewable fuel suppliers, petroleum fuel suppliers. So we sort of have anybody who's in the diesel business, small engine, large engine, on-road, off-road, all part of the activity. But getting back to the name of the forum was chosen pretty deliberately. They wanted to start something that was not an industry trade association. They already had that. They already had that with the truck and engine manufacturers, the oil industry, the API, or whatever. They wanted it to be a place where folks would feel welcome coming to talk about issues relative to diesel, and where the organization would feel comfortable talking with other stakeholders in the environmental community, and of course the media. And so really that's how the forum got started. And 22 years later, here we are.
Yeah, it's amazing how time flies, isn't it? And NACFE, we talk about us being unbiased, and that becomes a bit of a similar, I'll call it a safe place for discussions. There's so much going on. It sounds like the forum is similar to that. How about you yourself? I know you mentioned the ATA a bit, but tell us about your career. Kind of what were some maybe key moments back that kind of got you to where you are now and helped prepare you for what you're doing today.
Oh boy. Okay. So like many folks, I didn't really have a preordained direct path to being the executive director at the Diesel Technology Forum. I had one foot squarely in the healthcare medical world, and one foot in other places. So I had asthma as a kid growing up, and that gave me a pretty good perspective about air pollution and things in your environment and that sort of thing. And I was a little known fact. I was a respiratory therapist for about 4 years during all my
Wow.
undergrad.
That
Yeah.
is a little, that is, I mean, that it also tells me, and how you appreciate the work that's coming, that we're doing, or not only coming, but that we've been through, around diesel. I had a guest of mine, I'm kind of interrupting you, so we'll come back to your career, but I had a guest of mine recently say that, the people and the companies that selected diesel for the fuel of choice for freight never imagined the consequences of the exhaust to the environment. It was his thought, and he was actually, I think, quoting somebody else. But that struck me, I mean, and so, what decisions are we making now that we have no idea the adverse consequences that might come down the road? But we might get into that. But go ahead, Alan.
Yeah, no, I'd love the chance to respond to that. And so I was I was in the healthcare industry and working in respiratory therapy, and then I started working towards a master's degree in environmental health at Hopkins School of Public Health, and got a job working as somebody managing a research lab in the clinical pulmonary medicine world. And we actually did exposure testing on men with heart disease, trying to determine whether or not the carbon monoxide ambient air quality standard was protective enough of the most sensitive portion of the population, which in that case was people with heart disease, because carbon monoxide limits your body's ability to have the right supply of oxygen on board. So, I was deeply entrenched in white coats and laboratory and drawing blood and doing lung function tests and all that. And once I graduated, got my master's, and I just came upon an opportunity. ATA was advertising for an environmental specialist that was going to start a new program with environmental and occupational health. And I thought, wow, that sounds pretty interesting. So, I started there in 1987 and spent 13 years there and kind of finished up as the vice president of environmental policy. But it was really a great time in my life that it gave me a chance to see and learn so much about this industry. I worked with 50 state trucking associations on issues like, smoke emission standards and roadside testing in their states. I did a lot of work on Capitol Hill during the 1990 Clean Air Act amendments, and that was a great way to understand how Congress really works. Of course, it did really work back then, not so much today, maybe. But it was a great experience at ATA, and I got to travel a lot and see a lot of people. And of course, I got very close to a lot of the truck and engine manufacturers during that time. I worked on an SAE standards committee on the first smoke opacity standard, SAE J1667, and made some regular trips to Detroit and Chicago, and we hammered out a standard at that time that told us how to measure smoke emissions from diesel trucks, which is kind of kooky considering where we are today.
The diesel story, Alan, over the past 40 years is really amazing. I mean, I think some of us, we've been through it in our careers. I mean, we're about the same age, and so we've watched it sort of happen somewhat slowly. But I had the opportunity to make a lecture last year for SAE, the Buckendale lecture, and I took the opportunity to brag a bit about our industry. And you think at 40 years, 20 years, the first 20 years we were cleaning up harmful emissions, NOx and particulate matter, and now then from up till that 2000 timeframe that you were talking about, and that went into 2010 with the last recent round of NOx, and then now 20 years that we're in the middle of with respect to fuel economy and greenhouse gas emissions. Man, we've got very clean diesel that are getting on highway tractors moved from, and I always say 6 to 8 to 10 mile per gallon over this time period. What a great success story. Are we too modest in not talking about it, or is there just so many other challenges that we're just on to the next one, Alan? And I guess maybe first, do you agree with all that?
Absolutely. I mean, I think you're spot on that we're way too modest and don't really talk about that the way we should. I remember back when I was at ATA talking to fleets about really starting to have some environmental sensibility that, every time that you put a new truck on the road, or every time you make sure there's an oil change and tire pressure is checked, Those are all little things, but they add up to be big things. And they're the things that, enable us to have the kind of progress and for folks to feel ownership in the choices that they're making and how they are contributing to a cleaner environment. And I feel like, industry needs to not be so critical of itself as much and talk about the good parts and those simple things, as really add up, whether that driver's, thinking about 55 or if he's thinking about getting home really fast and how far can he push it. Those matter, and they matter in terms of efficiency and emissions and economics. So I think we can do better talking about progress.
Yeah, and these emissions are cumulative no matter what you're talking about. I mean, so what we do today with these trucks, and you mentioned a number of low-hanging fruit items around, driving slower, making sure you're checking all your components that they're working right, and on and on. And it's just the black smoke's gone. The aerodynamics and the efficiency and uptime that have come with these highly efficient trucks. It's a great, that starts with the diesel engine. It is really great. But it comes at now with more challenges around primarily, continued focus on NOx. I mean, we've had a recent proposal on a rulemaking that on NOx, but we've also, just there's opportunities to have, very low or even zero emission technologies coming with electric and hydrogen and other sort of things. So how does, how does all that fit with what you view, I guess, as we start to turn to look at the future? How does all that fitting and how do you think about that and what do you do about it?
Yeah, it's quite a departure from some of the conventional thinking and circumstances that we've experienced in the last 20 years in the trucking industry. And I firmly remember back in when 1999, 2000, when the current standards were adopted, folks their chins were dropping and they were, not sure how you were ever going to get a diesel engine to be, close to zero emissions. I mean, how was that even going to happen? And, my God, we had to completely change the diesel fuel quality. And that was, something yet again. So somehow all that came together. And, this next challenge is considerably more complicated. I think, first of all, to the good credit that you guys do at NACFE, the bridge concept that you have really, helps folks visualize kind of this continuum that we're on. And it is very good. And I profess to having used it in a good number of my presentations since I first saw it. So thank you for that. It is, though, one-dimensional. And I think, it sort of presupposes in some level that all trucking companies and fleets are alike, and the adoption of these new technologies might be linear. And, my experience in the industry suggests anything but that. I saw this dichotomy when I was at ATA. We had, sort of the national carriers, the folks that were very progressive on every aspect of trucking and running their business. And then we are always thinking about, the majority of the industry, which was the small guys, the fleets of 20 or less vehicles that, the sort of what you call the mom and pop type truckers, the ones that, built their business into a namesake and were proud to have their name painted on the side of the trucks and trailers, serving their community and their state and their region. And if they were lucky, maybe even nationwide. So, I think it's going to be an interesting time. I think I see a lot of material out there about the future and which fuels and technology are going to be the winner, so to speak. And, there's also lots of hyperventilating about it.
Yeah. So I think one of the things that I've learned over the last, I guess forever, but really in the last 10 years is that due to the broadness or diversity or variations that occur in commercial trucking. So you've got small trucks, you got big trucks, you got over the road, you got urban, there's there's less than truckload, private, dedicated, tankers, flat. I mean, on and on.
Yeah.
All these elements, some operate in different states with different rules and regulations. And so because of that, and that quite frankly is why I've made a career of it. It's just fun. But because of that, there's always early adopters of great solutions because it applies to them in particular. And then that same technology doesn't apply at all to others. We're seeing that right now with electric trucks where, if you're smaller or you're return to base every day and you can put charging in place at that location, it becomes a viable option for you to think about and consider. But if you're in irregular routes, doing long haul, it's nowhere close. That may be the most obvious of the point I'm trying to make, where that makes it really challenging for a lot of people who know a little bit about trucking or maybe a lot about trucking. But the fact is that technologies work really well in some places and not in others, much more than things like light duty passenger cars and other marketplaces.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the challenges that we have is, there's such a move afoot on electrification of the passenger vehicle fleet, that folks sometimes, sort of overlay what's possible in the passenger car sector and what's possible in the heavy duty sector. And, it's clearly an apples and oranges kind of comparison. I think, one of the things that, for me, I sort of feel like, we can oversimplify here a little bit maybe, but, today the pendulum is pretty much all diesel. And some we're sort of seeing a swing to the other side where we're talking about all electric or all something else, hydrogen, EV, battery, whatever. But like a pendulum, the balance usually tips back towards the middle at some point. And so I think you hear a lot about the future being eclectic, and I think that's ultimately what we're going to have here in the next couple of decades as these technologies start to shake out and we understand what's real, what's possible, what's not going to come about for whatever reason. There's so many factors today, not to mention what's the the geopolitical situation, but just the basics.
Right. Yeah, and so I got to ask you. I mean, you and I participated in a debate a couple of weeks ago, and it was on what will dominate. What solution will dominate heavy duty long haul trucking by 2030, so short 8 years away. And you, of course, debated on the diesel side, but we also had some experts telling us why battery electric trucks will dominate in long haul and why hydrogen would. You remember that, right? I mean, you did a great job, and I moderated it, and I tried to make it a little bit like a presidential candidate debate, and get under your skin a little bit as a moderator.
As you should.
Yeah, and it was fun. Tell us a little bit about it, and what do you recall from that, and what moments did you feel like you had great points, and maybe a few where you were a little unsteady on? But debating for diesel in 2030, tell us.
Honestly, it really wasn't that complicated because I think, at the outset, pretty much everybody said 2030, come on, diesel's going to continue to be the dominant technology. I mean, who could imagine that in 8 years, this kind of overwhelming change could happen in a way that would, see 51% of new truck purchases and the infrastructure to support those be something other than diesel. So, one of the things I said was, 2030 I feel pretty confident there. And I can feel pretty confident at 2040 just the same, because there are so many uncertainties bringing in some of the new technologies. But, it was a lot of fun. And I think, we all said at the end that, hey, at the end of the day, this climate change is a real challenge. We've got to step up and do it. And it's going to take more than one solution. And, all of these fuels and technologies have a part in that.
Yeah, I enjoyed it too, and I think there were both the sort of the common big discussions around why diesel or battery. Let me say it this way: there was the common big advantages and challenges of diesel, battery, and hydrogen, but we also got into some details because I think we're moving to a point now where, in some of these cases with these technologies, they will scale to some extent. And we're starting to really look at the implementation and execution of that happening. So, we're in the weeds on some of these things. So I really appreciated you and your counterparts really getting into some of the details of these different technologies and how they will find their way over the next couple of decades.
Absolutely. And there's a lot of great companies with great people there, working on these. And these are the, traditional diesel truck and engine manufacturers. So, having worked with those guys for the better part of, 30 couple years, I know what they're capable of. So I fully see that these alternative fuels will be a success at some level, at some point in time. I think, to say otherwise is to not be, somewhat out of touch with reality.
Yeah, and and I've said this a lot. I think a number of years ago, if I was to, if Mike Roth 10 years ago was just plunked into today, and I would be really concerned about the industry's ability to handle all this. Electrification. Even we haven't talked about autonomy and other things that are, that's really opportunistic and in front of us. But I feel pretty confident. I mean that we have an interesting mix of startups and traditional manufacturers. You got different NGOs, some helpful, maybe some not so helpful, but we've got a lot going on, and I feel a sense of real let's figure this out and figure it out for the right sectors and make good decisions. But it's complex. So yeah, it'll be a rocky but really fun ride.
Indeed. And, I think that, back in the 60s and 70s, when, diesel emerged as the primary technology and fuel for the commercial trucking sector, the folks at that time, were making the best decision that they could based on the data and the moment. And, what was the alternative? What were we talking about? Large bore gasoline engines. I mean, just imagine the economic and environmental impact of having done that. The greenhouse gas emissions, diesel has 12% more energy content alone. So it's hard to imagine that it could have gone better back then. And, I think we know a lot more today than we did, obviously, back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And, I think that that's going to help inform our experience going forward.
Yeah, so one, we're running out of time, Alan. It always happens fast. But what are some of the key next steps for diesels as we move forward, given all of this? Is it bio or renewable? Is it working with the truck manufacturers? Is it this latest, NOx and NOx and greenhouse gas rule coming together? I mean, what are some of the kind of the key next pieces? Maybe this is, what's on your forum's agenda over the next couple of years, but what are they?
Yeah, so I think certainly still plenty of opportunity here with diesel. Both I think on the simple side and then maybe the more complex side. First of all, you're starting to see the introduction and some of the business decisions around bringing some of the technology companies into the truck and engine manufacturer space. Companies like Jake Brake, now part of, or soon to be part of the Cummins enterprise, and others. They bring, things like cylinder deactivation and, maybe even some more of the start-stop technologies like we've had in passenger vehicles. And those all contribute to saving fuel, of course. So those are some of the, more low-hanging fruit. And then you get into things like waste heat recovery and, second and third generation SCR systems. So I think there's a lot of technology still there to make diesel be able to meet this even nearer to zero standard. I guess the thing that worries me more about it than anything is that this rule doesn't address one of the big challenges at all. And that is, what about this legacy fleet? Because, we're talking now about diesel engines today are 98% lower in both NOx and PM than they were over a decade ago. And we're talking about, getting anywhere from 40, 60, 75% further reduction of a very small number already. So we're going to spend tremendous cost and time and effort to try and get into that little teeny weeny box. But we're not going to address anything about the, half of the fleet out there is pre-2011. And, what would be the NOx benefit and the greenhouse gas benefit from simply helping to get old trucks off the road and get newer technology, diesel or natural gas, in their hands for the next 5 to 10 to 15 years as these new technologies have a chance to scale? What would be the benefit of that? And I think that's the thing that this rule does not address. Yet I think we really must address that if we're going to have the kind of progress that we need on improving the air quality and also meeting the climate challenge.
Alan, thanks so much for joining me. You're doing some very interesting work there, and keeping us grounded in the work that we can do right now, saving fuel, saving emissions, and really moving forward. So thanks, and it's been a pleasure having you on the show.
Great, Mike. Thank you very much.
Freight Efficiency with NACFE's Mike Rosen Friends.